There's a world beneath you right now. Not a metaphor, not a distant concept, not something that exists only in the imagination of scientists or the pages of textbooks, but a real, breathing, living world that sits directly beneath the surface of the ocean, pressing down through miles of cold water, existing in total darkness, under pressures so extreme they would crush the human body in an instant. It is not on another planet. It is not in another galaxy. It is here on Earth right now as you watch this, as you breathe, as your heart beats in the warmth and light of wherever you are sitting. Directly beneath the waves of our ocean, something is moving, something is hunting, something is waiting, and that something has been doing so for hundreds of millions of years, long before the first human eye ever looked up at the stars and wondered whether we were alone in the universe. We spend enormous amounts of time and resources searching the cosmos for signs of alien life, pointing our telescopes outward into the infinite dark of space, listening for signals from civilizations that may or may not exist across distances so vast that the numbers themselves lose meaning. And yet right here on our own planet, beneath the surface of the water that covers more than 70% of Earth's surface, there exists a realm so foreign, so fundamentally different from anything we experience in our daily lives, that the creatures living there look, behave, and survive in ways that seem to come directly from the imagination of a science fiction writer. They glow in colors we have no names for. They hunt with organs we have no equivalent of. They endure pressures, temperatures, and conditions of darkness so complete that the word darkness itself feels inadequate to describe what they live inside every single moment of their existence. This is the deep ocean, and it is about to change the way you think about life itself. What you're going to witness over the course of the next 2 hours is not just a collection of strange and beautiful creatures. It is not simply a nature documentary designed to make you say, wow, and then move on with your day. What this journey is designed to do, what it is genuinely capable of doing, if you let it, is to shift something fundamental in the way you understand evolution, adaptation, biology, and the very definition of what it means to be a living thing. Because the deep ocean does not play by the rules, or rather it plays by a completely different set of rules. Rules that were written not by convenience or comfort, but by pressure and darkness and cold, and the relentless, merciless logic of survival in a place where every single calorie matters, where every movement costs energy that might not be replaced for days or weeks, where the difference between existing and ceasing to exist is measured not in speed or strength, but in patience, efficiency, and an almost unimaginable capacity for adaptation. We are going to descend together. We are going to start at the surface, where sunlight still reaches and life still looks familiar, and we are going to go down. Slowly, deliberately, the way the ocean itself forces you to go with respect for what lies ahead. And as we go deeper, you will notice something happening. The creatures around us will begin to change. The shapes will become unfamiliar. The behaviors will stop making sense by the logic of the surface world. The eyes will grow enormous or disappear entirely. The bodies will stretch and twist into forms that have no surface equivalent. And the light, the constant, taken for granted light that makes our world visible and comprehensible, will fade and dim and eventually vanish, leaving behind only the cold and the dark and the impossibly slow, impossibly ancient, impossibly beautiful pulse of life in the deep. By the time we reach the bottom, you will understand something that most people never fully grasp. That the surface world, the world of sunlight and warmth and air and all the familiar creatures we have grown up knowing and naming and studying, that world is not the whole story. In fact, it might not even be the majority of the story. The deep ocean is Earth's largest habitat. The largest single living environment on our planet is not the rainforest. It is not the plains or the mountains or the coral reefs. It is the deep, dark, cold water column that fills the ocean below the reach of sunlight. And almost everything that lives there has never been seen by human eyes. Almost everything that has ever lived there has evolved, reproduced, adapted, and eventually died without a single human being ever knowing it existed. That is extraordinary. That is humbling. And that is exactly where we are going. So take a breath, take a moment. And let's go down. The surface of the ocean on a clear day is one of the most beautiful things on Earth. Light pours into it from above, fracturing into brilliant shafts and columns that reach down into the water like fingers of gold. At the very surface, the water is warm and rich and busy with life. Phytoplankton, microscopic organisms so small that millions of them fit into a single cup of water, drift in vast, invisible clouds, capturing sunlight and converting it into the chemical energy that forms the foundation of almost every food chain in the ocean. These tiny plants are so fundamental to life on Earth that they produce somewhere between 50 and 80% of the oxygen in our atmosphere. Every other breath you take is, in a very real sense, a gift from the sunlit surface of the sea. This surface zone, which scientists call the epipelagic zone, extends from the surface down to a depth of approximately 200 meters, about 650 feet. In the grand scheme of the ocean's depth, which reaches nearly 11,000 meters at its deepest point, 200 meters is almost nothing. It is barely a scratch, but in terms of life, it is extraordinarily rich. Fish of all sizes move through these upper layers in schools that can stretch for miles. Dolphins and whales cruise through, breathing at the surface before diving down for food. Jellyfish drift on currents like living glass ornaments. Sea turtles paddle slowly through warm water, navigating by magnetic fields with a precision that human technology has only recently begun to understand. Seabirds dive from above, plunging through the surface to snatch fish from just below it. At the surface, everything connects. Everything feeds, everything is bathed in the energy of the sun. And it is that energy, that seemingly endless, generous, taken for granted sunlight that makes almost everything in the surface world possible. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants and plant-like organisms convert sunlight into sugar and oxygen, is the engine that drives the entire surface ecosystem. Remove the light and the engine stops. Remove the engine and the food chain begins to fracture. Remove the food chain and the entire familiar architecture of surface life collapses. This is exactly what happens as you go deeper. Light begins to fail. It does not fail all at once. It fails gradually in layers, like the slow dimming of a lamp as the battery drains. At the surface, in clear tropical water, light is abundant and multispectral, meaning it contains the full rainbow of wavelengths, from the long red waves that give sunsets their color to the short blue and violet waves that make a tropical reef glow with impossible clarity. But as light passes through water, different wavelengths are absorbed at different rates. Red light, the longest wavelength in the visible spectrum, begins to disappear almost immediately. By the time you are just a few meters below the surface, most of the red has already been filtered out. This is why underwater photographs taken without artificial light often look bluish or greenish. The warmer colors have already been absorbed by the water column above. As you continue to descend, orange goes, then yellow, then green. What remains, penetrating deeper than all the others, is blue. Blue light travels the farthest through water. It is the last color to fade, the final remnant of the sun's generosity reaching down into the dark. And even blue, that stubborn and persistent traveler, eventually gives up. In clear ocean water, blue light effectively disappears somewhere between 200 and 1,000 meters. Below that, there is no sunlight, none. Absolute, complete, total darkness, not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where your eyes eventually adjust and you can make out shapes, but the darkness of a world where light has never reached in any biologically meaningful way for hundreds of millions of years. This transition zone, where light goes from dim to gone, is called the mesopelagic zone. It sits between 200 and 1,000 meters deep. Scientists also call it the twilight zone, and the name is apt. It is a zone of in-between, not fully lit, not fully dark, but occupying the uncertain territory between the two. And it is here that you begin to see, for the first time, how profoundly the loss of light shapes a living thing. In the twilight zone, light is not just scarce, it is directional. During the day, what little light exists comes from above, a dim, diffuse blue glow that gives the water a kind of ghostly luminescence. During the night, even that disappears. This creates a unique visual challenge for the creatures living here. In the surface world, an animal's visual system is calibrated to handle a wide range of lighting conditions, bright midday sun, dim evening twilight, the soft glow of a cloudy day. The eye adjusts, the pupil dilates, the visual cortex processes what it receives. But in the twilight zone, the range of available light is so narrow and so dim that surface-style eyes are almost useless. Nature's response to this problem is one of the most elegant demonstrations of evolutionary adaptation you will ever see. Instead of abandoning vision entirely, which remains useful in the twilight zone because some light still exists, creatures here evolve eyes that are redesigned from the ground up to capture the maximum possible amount of what little light remains. The result is eyes that, relative to body size, are among the largest in the animal kingdom, not just a little larger. Dramatically, spectacularly, almost absurdly larger. Consider the giant squid. It is well known for its enormous size, a creature that can reach lengths of 13 meters or more, with arms that could wrap around a small car. But the feature that most captures the imagination of biologists is its eye. The eye of a giant squid is approximately 27 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a dinner plate. It is the largest eye of any living animal on Earth. And it exists for one specific reason: to gather as much light as possible in the dim, deep water where giant squid live, allowing them to detect the faint bioluminescent flashes produced by their primary predator, the sperm whale, as it moves through the dark water above them. Think about that for a moment, an eye the size of a dinner plate. Evolved not to see the world in rich, colorful detail, but specifically to detect a single, critical visual signal in an environment where almost nothing else is visible. That is not waste, that is not excess. That is precision engineering shaped by millions of years of predator-prey interaction in an environment where the wrong choice, missing the signal, failing to detect the approaching whale, being just a fraction too slow to respond, means death. And the giant squid is not alone. Across the twilight zone, creature after creature has evolved eyes that push the boundaries of what we think a visual organ can do. The telescope fish, a small and deeply strange-looking creature of the mesopelagic, has tubular eyes that point directly upward and are essentially biological telescopes, designed to silhouette prey against the dim blue glow from above. The deep-sea fish known as the barreleye or Macropina microstoma has transparent, fluid-filled heads through which its tubular eyes can be seen pointing upward, rotating to track light sources with extraordinary precision. When researchers first observed these fish through the windows of deep-sea submersibles, they noticed what appeared to be yellow-green lenses fixed in a permanently upward-pointing gaze. It was only when high-definition cameras captured the animals in undisturbed conditions that scientists realized the visible lenses were not the eyes themselves, they were olfactory organs. The actual eyes were inside the transparent head, capable of rotating from pointing upward to pointing forward, giving the fish a field of vision that no scientist had anticipated. This is what the twilight zone does. It forces life to innovate in ways that are not just unexpected but genuinely astonishing. Every solution to the problem of dim light is a window into the creative power of evolution, the ability of random variation and selective pressure to produce, over geological time scales, biological structures of breathtaking sophistication. But not every creature in the twilight zone invests in vision. Some take the opposite approach. Some begin at these depths what becomes a complete abandonment of sight, a wholesale restructuring of the sensory world away from light and toward other, more reliable sources of information. Touch, vibration, chemical detection, pressure waves, these senses, which are supplements to vision in the surface world, become primary tools in the deep. And as we will see when we go deeper still, in the creatures that live far below where any light reaches at all, they become the entire foundation of how a living thing understands and navigates its world. The lateral line system, found in many fish, is one of the most important of these non-visual senses. It is a network of sensory cells that runs along the sides of a fish's body, detecting tiny disturbances and pressure changes in the surrounding water. In surface fish, the lateral line supplements vision. It helps a schooling fish maintain its position relative to its neighbors, helps a predator detect the movements of prey in murky water. But in the deep, where vision is limited or absent, the lateral line becomes the primary tool for sensing the environment. Some deep-sea fish have lateral line systems so sensitive that they can detect the movement of a single small creature several meters away, building a three-dimensional picture of their immediate surroundings from nothing more than the tiny ripples of disturbed water. Chemical sensing becomes similarly elevated in importance. The water column carries molecules, proteins, lipids, the chemical signatures of living things, and many deep-sea creatures have evolved olfactory systems of extraordinary sensitivity, capable of detecting these chemical traces at concentrations so dilute they are almost vanishingly small. The sense of smell in the deep ocean functions the way sight functions at the surface. It tells you what is there, where it is going, how long ago it passed through. A deep-sea shark following a chemical trail through dark water is doing something functionally equivalent to a surface predator following a visual target. The information source has changed. The fundamental strategy, detect, locate, pursue, remains the same. This pattern of the same basic biological problem being solved by entirely different sensory tools depending on the environment is one of the deep ocean's most important lessons. It demonstrates something that biologists call convergent evolution, the tendency of different species facing similar environmental challenges to arrive at similar functional solutions through completely different evolutionary pathways. In the deep ocean, convergent evolution is on display everywhere because the challenges are so universal and so extreme. The darkness, the cold, the pressure, the scarcity of food, these are the same for every creature at a given depth, regardless of what evolutionary lineage it comes from. And so life again and again arrives at the same solutions from different starting points. Let us keep going deeper. The twilight zone is behind us now. The last traces of blue light have faded. Ahead of us lies the midnight zone, the bathypelagic, stretching from 1,000 meters to 4,000 meters below the surface. Here there is no light except what life itself creates. Here the temperature hovers just above freezing. Here the pressure is somewhere between 100 and 400 times the pressure at the surface, a force so immense that it compresses the air in your lungs to a fraction of their normal volume, that it would squeeze the blood vessels in your body, that it would kill you with a thoroughness and efficiency that requires no additional comment. And yet, life is here. Not sparse, tentative, barely surviving life. Real life, diverse, complex, adapted life. Life that has been here for so long, through so many cycles of geological time, through so many mass extinctions and climate shifts and changes in ocean chemistry, that it has had time to evolve solutions to these conditions that make the midnight zone not merely habitable but genuinely, efficiently, effectively home. The darkness of the midnight zone is different from the darkness of a room with the lights off. It is different from the darkness of a cave or a cloudy night or the inside of a closed box. It is complete. It is physical. It is a darkness that has existed here for so long that it has shaped the very architecture of the bodies and brains of the creatures that live in it. Eyes that would be useless here have either disappeared entirely, absorbed back into the body over evolutionary time, their proteins repurposed for other uses, or have been transformed into something so specialized that they bear almost no resemblance to the light-gathering organs of surface creatures. Many fish in the midnight zone have eyes that detect only bioluminescence, the light produced by living organisms themselves. These eyes are not calibrated to see the world in detail. They are calibrated to detect flashes, brief, bright, specific flashes of blue-green light that carry encoded information in the darkness. The frequency of a flash, the pattern of a series of flashes, the position and direction of a moving light source. These are the signals that matter in the midnight zone, and the eyes of its inhabitants are tuned to receive them with extraordinary precision. But before we explore bioluminescence in the detail it deserves, and it deserves a great deal of detail, because it is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the natural world, we need to understand something about how life in the midnight zone actually functions on a day-to-day basis, because it is fundamentally different from how life functions at the surface in ways that go far beyond the absence of light. At the surface, life is driven by energy. Sunlight pours in, photosynthesis converts it to sugar, that sugar feeds herbivores, those herbivores feed carnivores, and the whole system runs on a generous, continuous, reliable supply of solar energy. The ecosystem is fast-moving, competitive, and wasteful in the way that only a system with abundant resources can afford to be. Surface fish chase prey at high speed. Dolphins leap and spin with exuberant energy expenditure. Seabirds wheel and dive in behaviors that burn enormous amounts of calories. The surface ocean is, in energetic terms, a place of extravagance, a place where enough energy flows in that organisms can afford to spend it freely in the competition for resources and mates and territory. The midnight zone has none of this. Energy is scarce. Food is unpredictable. The supply of organic material drifting down from above, what scientists call marine snow, a constant, gentle precipitation of dead and dying organisms, fecal material and organic debris from the surface world, is thin and dilute and cannot be relied upon as a consistent source of calories. In this environment, waste is not just inefficiency, it is death. An organism that burns more energy than it can reliably replace will die. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, patient certainty of simple arithmetic. The response of life in the midnight zone to this energetic reality is one of the most profound and far-reaching adaptations in the entire natural world, a wholesale reduction in metabolic rate, and with it, a complete reimagining of what a body needs to be made of and how it needs to move. Metabolic rate, the speed at which an organism burns energy to power its basic biological processes, is directly tied to the cost of keeping a body alive and functional. In warm-blooded surface animals, metabolic rate is high because maintaining body temperature requires constant energy expenditure. But even in cold-blooded surface fish, metabolism runs at a certain minimum rate that keeps muscles toned and ready for the bursts of activity that surface life demands. In the midnight zone, where cold-bloodedness is universal and where bursts of high-speed activity are not just unnecessary but actually dangerous in their energy cost, metabolic rates slow to a fraction of what they are at the surface. The muscles themselves change. Surface fish muscles are dense with proteins and packed with the molecular machinery needed for rapid, powerful contractions. Deep-sea fish muscles are different. They are often described as watery or gelatinous, lacking the dense protein content of surface fish. This is not a deficiency. It is an adaptation. Dense muscle tissue is metabolically expensive to maintain. It requires constant energy input just to keep it functional. Deep-sea fish that have reduced the protein content of their muscles are carrying less metabolic baggage. They are bodies stripped of everything that is not essential, running on the minimum necessary to remain alive and functional. This creates creatures that, by the standards of the surface world, appear almost inert. A deep-sea fish drifting in the midnight zone may hold almost perfectly still for hours or even days, expending almost no energy, simply waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for food to come to it, because in the midnight zone, one of the most energy-efficient hunting strategies available is simply to be still, to be invisible, to occupy a position in the water column and wait for prey to come close enough to strike. The energy cost of this strategy is minimal. The potential reward, a meal that might provide enough calories to last for days or weeks, is enormous. Patient waiting beats active pursuit in an environment where the cost of chasing and the unpredictability of finding prey make active hunting a losing proposition. The anglerfish is the most famous example of this patient, wait, and ambush strategy, and for good reason. It embodies it so perfectly, so completely, so elegantly that it has become one of the defining images of deep-sea life. But the anglerfish is not just famous for waiting. It is famous for the extraordinary tool it uses to bring prey to it, a bioluminescent lure dangled in front of its enormous, tooth-filled mouth like a lantern in the dark. Let us talk about bioluminescence. because it is, without exaggeration, one of the most astonishing phenomena in the living world, and in the deep ocean it is not a curiosity or a specialty of a few unusual species. In the midnight zone and below, bioluminescence is estimated to be present in 60 to 90% of all organisms. It is not a rare adaptation. It is practically universal. It is the defining feature of life in permanent darkness, the way that photosynthesis is the defining feature of life in sunlight. The deep ocean has not simply lost the sun's light. It has replaced it with light made by living things themselves, for purposes as varied and sophisticated as any communication system on Earth. Bioluminescence is the production of light by a chemical reaction inside a living organism. The basic chemistry involves a compound called luciferin, which reacts with oxygen in the presence of an enzyme called luciferase to produce light. This reaction is extraordinarily efficient, unlike a light bulb or a candle, which converts most of their energy input into heat. Bioluminescent reactions convert nearly all of their energy input into light. It is cold light in the most literal sense, light produced without heat. And because heat is energy and energy is scarce in the deep ocean, the efficiency of bioluminescence is not just elegant, it is essential. But the chemistry, impressive as it is only the beginning. The truly remarkable thing about bioluminescence in the deep ocean is not that it exists, but how it is used. Life in the dark has found more ways to use the production of light than any surface creature has ever needed to imagine, because light in the dark has properties and functions that light in a sunlit environment simply does not have. At the surface, where everything is already lit by the sun, making your own light is of limited value. Total darkness, making your own light or controlling the light that reaches you, is one of the most powerful things a living organism can do. Luring prey is the function most people associate with bioluminescence, thanks largely to the anglerfish and its iconic photophore, the glowing structure at the end of the modified dorsal fin spine that dangles in front of its mouth. The anglerfish's lure glows with blue-green light, produced by a colony of bioluminescent bacteria housed inside the photophore. Small fish and invertebrates, attracted to the light in the surrounding darkness, approach to investigate. They come within range of the anglerfish's mouth, a mouth lined with long, recurved teeth that point inward, making escape impossible once something is inside. The jaws snap shut, the prey disappears. The anglerfish resumes its patient wait, but the anglerfish, as famous and as perfectly adapted as it is just one expression of a strategy that takes dozens of different forms in the midnight zone. The dragonfish has a long chin barbel tipped with a bioluminescent lure that it can maneuver in the water to imitate the movements of small prey, attracting larger prey that comes to eat what appears to be an easy meal. The cookie-cutter shark, one of the most unusual sharks in the ocean, uses bioluminescent counter-illumination on its underside to blend with the faint light from above, while its non-luminescent collar creates a silhouette that mimics a small fish, luring large tuna and dolphins and even other sharks to investigate what looks like an easy meal, at which point the cookie-cutter turns the tables and takes a circular, cookie-shaped bite of flesh. Counter-illumination is a bioluminescent strategy that deserves particular attention because it is so conceptually elegant. In the dim upper layers of the midnight zone, where faint light still filters down from above, a creature viewed from below is silhouetted against that faint glow, a dark shape against a slightly lighter background. This silhouette is visible to predators lurking below, and it is a potentially fatal liability. Counter-illumination solves this problem by covering the underside of the body with photophores that produce light of exactly the same intensity and color as the background light from above. The result is that the silhouette disappears. The creature becomes from below invisible against the background light. It is a form of active camouflage, not the passive, pigment-based camouflage of surface creatures, but a dynamic, responsive, living camouflage that adjusts to changing light conditions. The hatchetfish, one of the more commonly encountered creatures of the mesopelagic and upper midnight zones, is a master of counter-illumination. Its body is covered with rows of photophores along its underside that produce a soft blue-green glow precisely matched to the ambient light filtering down from above. From any angle other than directly below, the hatchetfish is visible. Its sides are silvery and reflective, which creates its own form of camouflage by reflecting the surrounding water color. But from directly below, looking up against the faint light, the hatchetfish effectively vanishes. It is a creature that has solved the problem of visibility in the twilight zone with an answer so sophisticated it took human engineers decades to develop the equivalent technology for use in military applications. Bioluminescence is also used for communication, specifically for finding mates in the dark. In total darkness, finding a potential mate is a challenge that surface creatures solve largely with vision. The bright colors, elaborate displays, and courtship behaviors that are so familiar in the surface world are almost entirely dependent on visible light. Remove the light, and those strategies become useless. The deep ocean has responded by encoding courtship information into bioluminescent signals, species-specific patterns of flashing, that allow individuals of the same species to find each other in the dark without accidentally attracting predators or luring the wrong species. Some species of ostracod, tiny crustaceans that look like seeds with legs, produce bioluminescent courtship displays of extraordinary complexity. Males of certain species emit pulses of light in species-specific patterns as they swim upward through the water column, creating trails of light that look like strings of glowing beads against the darkness. Females, attracted by the correct pattern, follow the trail. The patterns are so precisely species-specific that different species can be performing their courtship displays simultaneously in the same water, and each female responds only to the pattern produced by males of her own species. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated communication system, encoded in light, evolved over millions of years, playing out continuously in waters where no human has ever witnessed it. There is also a defensive use of bioluminescence that is perhaps the most dramatic of all, the burglar alarm response. When a small creature in the deep ocean is attacked by a predator, it sometimes releases a burst of bioluminescent light, a sudden, bright flash that illuminates the surrounding water. This seems at first glance like exactly the wrong response to being attacked, since it makes the prey more visible. But the logic becomes clear when you consider what else is in the dark water around them. By producing a bright flash, the prey animal is not simply making itself visible, it is illuminating the predator attacking it, and that predator may itself have predators lurking in the dark. A suddenly illuminated midwater predator becomes a suddenly visible target for any larger predator in the area. The prey, by flashing, is effectively calling for help, or rather, is creating a situation in which its attacker may suddenly need to worry about something larger than itself. It is one of the most counterintuitive and sophisticated defensive strategies in the natural world, and it works precisely because of the unique conditions of the deep ocean environment, the complete darkness that makes light itself a weapon, and the constant presence of predation at every level of the food chain. Vampire squid, despite its name, it is not a true squid, uses bioluminescence in a particularly elegant defensive display. When threatened, it wraps its webbed arms over its body, exposing the spines on the inner surface of the arm web and creating an appearance that mimics a much larger, more dangerous creature. Simultaneously, it releases a cloud of bioluminescent mucus glowing particles that drift in the water and confuse a predator's senses, allowing the vampire squid to escape in the resulting distraction. It is a living special effect, a magic trick performed in permanent darkness. Let us now turn our attention to something that connects all of these adaptations, the bioluminescence, the oversized eyes, the chemical sensing, the patient waiting, to a single underlying reality of life in the deep ocean. That reality is the relationship between depth and food availability, or more precisely, the relationship between depth and the profound, fundamental scarcity of food. In the surface ocean, food is produced continuously. Phytoplankton grow in the sunlit water, absorbing carbon dioxide and producing oxygen and organic compounds that fuel the entire surface food chain. Zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. Small fish eat the zooplankton. Larger fish eat the small fish. And at every step in this chain, energy is transferred, used, and lost, but there is always more coming in from the sun, always more phytoplankton growing, always more fuel entering the system at the bottom. As you descend, this primary production stops. Below the sunlit zone, there is no photosynthesis. No new energy is entering the system from sunlight. Everything that lives in the deep ocean must therefore live on energy that originated at the surface and has somehow made its way down into the dark. This happens through several pathways. Marine snow, the constant, gentle precipitation of organic particles from above, is one of them. The daily vertical migrations of countless small organisms, which spend the daylight hours at depth and the nighttime hours at the surface feeding, bring organic material down when they descend. Large animal carcasses that sink from the surface, the bodies of whales, fish, and other large creatures, represent massive, concentrated packages of energy that descend to the seafloor and support entire communities of organisms. But these inputs, generous as they are in absolute terms, are spread over an enormous volume of water. The deep ocean is vast. It encompasses roughly 90% of the habitable space on Earth. The amount of food reaching any given point in this vast volume is, per unit volume, extraordinarily small. Organisms in the deep must therefore extract maximum value from minimum input. Every molecule of food that enters a deep-sea organism's body must be used with the utmost efficiency. And this requires a complete rethinking of how bodies are built and how they operate. We have already discussed the reduction in muscle protein and metabolic rate, but the adaptations for energy efficiency in the deep ocean go much further. Many deep-sea fish lack swim bladders, the gas-filled organs that surface fish use to maintain buoyancy. Swim bladders require energy to maintain, and at great depths the pressure differential required to keep them inflated becomes enormous, requiring significant metabolic investment. Instead, deep-sea fish achieve neutral buoyancy through other means, primarily by replacing the dense, heavy components of their bodies with lighter materials. The skeleton in many deep-sea fish is reduced and lightweight, sometimes consisting of cartilage rather than bone, or of bone so thin and porous it is almost transparent. The muscles, as we have discussed, are watery and light. The overall body density is reduced to match the density of seawater, achieving buoyancy without the metabolic cost of a swim bladder. This creates bodies that are by surface standards almost ghostly, light, thin, translucent, sometimes transparent. Many deep-sea shrimp and other crustaceans are completely transparent, their internal organs visible through their glassy bodies. This transparency is itself a form of camouflage. In water that is uniformly dark, a transparent body is as close to invisible as a physical object can get. But it is also, in part, a consequence of the reduction in pigmentation that comes with living in permanent darkness. Pigments are metabolically costly to produce and maintain. In an environment where visibility-based camouflage is not the primary concern, the cost of producing pigment is a luxury that many deep-sea organisms simply cannot afford. The reduction in body density also extends to the water content of tissues. Many deep-sea organisms have tissues with extraordinarily high water content. In some jellyfish and gelatinous zooplankton, the body may be more than 98% water. A creature that is essentially animated water is extraordinarily cheap to build and maintain. It requires almost no material investment beyond the basic biological machinery needed to stay alive, feed, and reproduce. It is not fragile, as we might assume, in the uniform pressure of the deep ocean. A body that matches the density and pressure of the surrounding water is actually extremely well suited to its environment. What is fragile is not the creature, but our assumptions about what a body needs to be. The body shapes of deep-sea organisms are extraordinary in their diversity and their departure from the familiar forms of surface life. In the surface world, body shape is constrained by a set of competing demands: hydrodynamic efficiency for movement, structural strength to resist the forces of wave action and current, and the specific functional requirements of different feeding and locomotion strategies. These constraints produce a certain convergence toward familiar forms, streamlined fish shapes, compact crustacean body plans, the general organization of tissues around a central body axis that we are so accustomed to seeing in the animal kingdom. In the deep ocean, some of these constraints are relaxed. The absence of wave action removes the need for structural resistance to wave forces. The reduced importance of active, high-speed locomotion reduces the selection pressure for hydrodynamic efficiency. And the specific challenges of food capture in a three-dimensional, dark, low density of prey environment create selection pressures for body forms that would be deeply disadvantageous at the surface, but are extraordinarily effective in the deep. The result is a parade of body forms that seem to violate every intuition we have about what animals should look like. The gulper eel, or pelican eel, has a body plan that prioritizes feeding capacity above almost everything else. Its body is long and eel-like, with a tail that is thin and whip-like and extends behind it into the dark water. But its head, and particularly its mouth, is enormously out of proportion to the rest of its body. The jaws of the gulper eel are longer than its entire trunk, and they can open to an angle of approximately 180 degrees, creating a cavernous gape that can accommodate prey larger than the eel itself. This extreme jaw development is directly connected to the unpredictability of food in the deep ocean. When a meal presents itself, you may not get another one for a long time. The ability to consume an extremely large prey item in a single encounter is, in this context, an extraordinarily valuable adaptation. The stomach of many deep-sea predators shows a similar adaptation. In some species, the stomach is so distensible, so capable of expanding, that it can accommodate prey items that are literally larger than the predator's entire body in its pre-feeding state. The stomach walls stretch to accommodate the incoming meal, and the predator then hangs motionless in the water, digesting slowly and continuously, while the energy from the meal is extracted and stored. This strategy, extreme infrequent feeding, extreme stomach capacity, and slow, thorough digestion, is the dietary equivalent of a body designed for feast and famine, a body that treats food not as a continuous resource but as an occasional windfall to be captured and extracted from with maximum efficiency. The black swallower is another creature that takes this strategy to its logical extreme. It is a small fish, typically only about 25 centimeters long. But its stomach can expand to accommodate prey items 3 times its own length and 10 times its own mass. Scientists have found specimens with prey still being digested inside them, prey so large that the swallower's body was visibly distorted by the contents of its stomach, stretched to the point of transparency, the outline of the prey item visible through the walls of the swallower's belly. In these cases, the prey was so large that the digestion process produced gases as it broke down, and in some instances the gas production caused the swallower to float to the surface, where it was discovered by fishermen who found a small dead fish with a large dead fish partially digested inside it, its stomach stretched to the point of rupture. This is life in the deep ocean, not monsters, not design failures. But creatures so precisely, so ruthlessly, so elegantly adapted to the specific demands of their environment that their features, which appear bizarre by our standards, are in fact the most logical possible responses to the conditions they face. The gulper eel's enormous mouth is not a deformity. It is a masterpiece of functional design. The black swallower's expandable stomach is not a grotesque excess. It is efficiency carried to its logical conclusion in an environment where efficiency is the difference between life and death. Let us descend further. Past 4,000 meters, past the deepest point of many ocean basins, we reach the abyssal zone, stretching from 4,000 to 6,000 meters. Here, the pressure is 400 to 600 times surface pressure. The temperature is typically between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. maintained at this temperature by the slow circulation of the ocean's deep waters, which were last at the surface in the polar regions, where they cooled and sank and began their long, slow journey around the globe in the deep circulation system known as the thermohaline circulation. The abyssal zone is dark, cold, still, and silent, and it is home to one of the most complex communities of organisms on Earth. The abyssal seafloor is not the barren, featureless wasteland it was once imagined to be. Nor is it, despite the classic sci-fi portrayal, a landscape of dramatic volcanic activity and glowing lava. For the most part, it is a landscape of extraordinary monotony, flat plains of soft sediment, built up over millions of years by the slow rain of marine snow from above and the accumulation of fine mineral particles, stretching for hundreds or thousands of miles in every direction. The sediment is fine-grained and soft, sometimes hundreds of meters deep, preserving a record of everything that has ever fallen to this spot in the entire history of the ocean above it. Every mass extinction, every volcanic winter, every period of ocean acidification, every change in the biological community of the surface, all of it is preserved in the sediment layers of the abyssal plain, a geological and biological archive of extraordinary value. On and just above this sediment, life exists in forms shaped by a specific challenge: how to make a living in a place where the only food is what falls from the world above. The supply of marine snow to the abyssal seafloor is extremely thin. Only 1 or 2% of the organic material produced at the surface survives the long journey to the bottom, the rest being consumed by organisms in the water column above. What arrives at the abyssal plain is highly processed, nutritionally poor, and sporadic in its supply. Yet life has found ways to extract sustenance from even this meager resource. Sea cucumbers, holothurians, in scientific terminology, are among the most abundant animals on the abyssal plain. They are extraordinary creatures, shaped like elongated tubes, moving slowly across the sediment on tiny tube feet, ingesting sediment as they go and extracting organic material from it with a thoroughness that would impress even the most efficient industrial processing operation. Some species of sea cucumber on the abyssal plain have been observed following tracks across the sediment, not tracks left by other animals, but tracks left by themselves, the areas of sediment they have already processed, which they avoid in favor of unprocessed sediment. They are mapping their own passage, maximizing their coverage of available food resources with a simple behavioral strategy that requires no intelligence, no complex nervous system, no planning in any conscious sense, just a simple tendency to avoid areas of recently disturbed sediment, produced by the same gradual, patient evolution that has shaped everything else in the deep. Deep-sea brittle stars carpet the abyssal plain in some regions, extending their thin, flexible arms into the water column above the sediment to capture sinking particles of organic material. Deep-sea sea urchins graze on the biofilm of bacteria and organic material that coats sediment particles. Polychaete worms burrow through the sediment in numbers that astonish scientists who sample abyssal cores. A single square meter of abyssal sediment may contain thousands of individual worms, each tiny, each processing the sediment around it, each contributing to the vast, slow, invisible recycling of organic material that is one of the deep ocean's most critical ecological functions. This recycling function is one of the most important things the deep ocean does for the planet as a whole. The organisms of the deep are not isolated curiosities. They are active participants in the global cycles of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other elements that make life on Earth possible. When organic material falls to the deep ocean floor and is consumed by abyssal organisms, the carbon in that material is sequestered from the atmosphere for thousands of years, removed from the carbon cycle that drives climate and atmospheric chemistry at the surface. The deep ocean in this way functions as the planet's largest long-term carbon storage system, absorbing and holding carbon that would otherwise contribute to greenhouse warming of the atmosphere. The sheer scale of this function is difficult to comprehend, Every year, billions of tons of organic carbon are produced at the ocean's surface by photosynthesizing organisms. A fraction of this carbon sinks into the deep ocean, where it is either consumed by deep-sea organisms and respired back as carbon dioxide, which itself stays in the cold, dense, deep water for centuries before returning to the surface, or buried in sediment where it remains sequestered for millions of years. The biological pump, as oceanographers call this process, is one of the most important regulators of Earth's climate, operating continuously, silently, invisibly, in the dark water that most people never think about and never see. There are places on the abyssal plain and in the deeper zones below it where the geological activity of the planet creates environments so radically different from the surrounding deep ocean conditions that they seem, even within the context of the already alien deep, like worlds within worlds. These are the hydrothermal vents, cracks, and fissures in the seafloor where superheated water, saturated with minerals dissolved from the rock below, pours out into the cold abyssal water. The water emerging from these vents can be extraordinarily hot. Some reach temperatures of over 400 degrees Celsius, though the high pressure prevents it from boiling, and it carries dissolved compounds of hydrogen sulfide, methane, and metals that are toxic to most surface life. But the creatures that live at hydrothermal vents do not just tolerate these conditions, they thrive in them. Because at the vents there is something that exists nowhere else in the deep ocean, a local source of energy that does not depend on sunlight or on the marine snow from above. The bacteria and archaea that colonize the vent environment have evolved to extract energy from the chemical compounds in the vent fluid, particularly hydrogen sulfide, through a process called chemosynthesis. Just as photosynthesis uses sunlight to power the conversion of carbon dioxide into organic compounds, chemosynthesis uses the chemical energy in hydrogen sulfide to accomplish the same conversion. The result is a primary production of organic material that is entirely independent of the sun, a food chain that begins not with light but with chemistry. The communities that build up around hydrothermal vents on the basis of this chemosynthetic primary production are among the most extraordinary on Earth. Giant tube worms, some reaching lengths of 2 meters, anchor themselves to the vent substrate and host chemosynthetic bacteria inside their bodies, essentially farming their own food source internally. Yeti crabs covered in stiff, bacteria-covered hairs that they appear to wave in the vent plumes harvest the bacteria growing on their own bodies. Vent shrimp crowd in enormous numbers around the hottest parts of the vent, feeding on the bacterial mats that grow there. Vent fish, octopuses, snails, and countless species of polychaete worm contribute to a community of extraordinary biodiversity that exists, essentially, as an island of life in the deep-sea desert, powered entirely by the chemical energy of the planet's internal heat. The discovery of hydrothermal vents in the late 1970s by a team of researchers aboard the submersible Alvin diving along the Galapagos Rift was one of the most significant moments in the history of biology. Not because it added a few new species to the catalog of known organisms, though it did that abundantly, but because it fundamentally changed our understanding of what life requires to exist. Before the discovery of vent communities, it was assumed that all life on Earth ultimately depended on sunlight, either directly through photosynthesis or indirectly through the food chains photosynthesis supports. The discovery of a thriving, diverse, complex ecosystem powered entirely by chemical energy in the complete absence of sunlight shattered that assumption. Life, it turns out, does not need sunlight, it needs energy, and energy can come from many sources. This realization has implications that extend far beyond the deep ocean. If life can thrive in the complete absence of sunlight, using chemical energy sources that exist wherever there is geological activity in water, and geological activity in water exist on numerous bodies in our solar system, from the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn to the potentially water-bearing subsurface of Mars, then the probability of life existing elsewhere in the universe is radically higher than we had previously imagined. The deep-sea vent communities are not just extraordinary ecosystems in their own right. They are proof of concept, evidence that life's requirements are far less specific than we thought, and that wherever the basic conditions for chemistry exist, life may find a way. And yet even within the deep ocean, even setting aside the extraordinary case of the hydrothermal vents, there is one more zone to explore, one more layer of depth and darkness and pressure that lies below even the abyssal plane. This is the hadal zone, named for Hades, the ancient Greek realm of the dead, which occupies the deepest trenches of the ocean, the narrow, elongated cuts in the seafloor where tectonic plates slide beneath one another, creating valleys of depth that plunge to nearly 11 kilometers at their deepest point. The hadal zone is the least explored environment on Earth. Far fewer humans have visited the deepest point of the ocean, Challenger Deep, in the Mariana Trench, than have walked on the surface of the Moon. The pressure at Challenger Deep is approximately 1,100 times surface pressure, a force of over 1,000 kilograms pressing on every square centimeter of any object that descends there. The cold is absolute, the dark is absolute. The distance from any surface influence is so great that it produces an environment of extraordinary isolation and extraordinary selectivity. Only organisms capable of surviving conditions that would be lethal to virtually every other living thing on Earth can exist here. And yet, organisms exist here. Not just bacteria, though bacteria are present in great abundance. Actual multicellular organisms, animals, recognizable as such, belonging to groups with relatives throughout the ocean, live at Challenger Deep and in other hadal trenches at comparable depths. Amphipods, small crustaceans that resemble shrimp, have been found in abundance in hadal trenches, scavenging on any organic material that falls to the trench floor. Polychaete worms and holothurians and snailfish, small, eel-like fish of the family Lipperidae, have been photographed and filmed at record depths, moving through the darkness with the same patient efficiency that characterizes life throughout the deep ocean. The snailfish discovered at hadal depths represent the deepest living fish ever documented, found at depths exceeding 8,000 meters. They are pale, translucent, and surprisingly abundant, gathered in numbers around bait dropped by unmanned landers. Their presence at these depths requires adaptations to pressure that are genuinely impressive. The proteins in their bodies must function correctly under pressures that would cause the proteins of surface organisms to fold incorrectly and cease to work. This is achieved through the accumulation of pressure-counteracting solutes, particularly a compound called trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO, in their tissues. TMAO physically stabilizes proteins against the compressive effects of high pressure, maintaining their three-dimensional shapes and allowing them to function correctly. As depth increases, the concentration of TMAO in hadal fish increases correspondingly, suggesting that there may be a depth limit beyond which the concentration of TMAO needed to counteract pressure becomes so high that it actually interferes with other biochemical processes, a natural ceiling to the depth at which fish can exist, perhaps somewhere around 8,500 meters. This is the kind of detail, the kind of specific, mechanistic, molecular explanation for a macroscopic adaptation that the deep ocean provides in abundance when we look closely enough. Every strange feature of every deep-sea creature is, at its root, a biochemical or physical or physiological response to a specific challenge posed by the environment. Nothing is random. Nothing is accidental. Everything is the product of selection pressure acting on variation over time, finding the best available solution to a specific problem in a specific environment. Which brings us at last to the deepest and most important theme of everything we have explored in this first part of our journey, the question of what alien really means and why the deep ocean forces us to reconsider it. When we call deep-sea creatures alien, we are expressing a sense of strangeness, a recognition that these organisms do not match our expectations of what living things should look like and how they should behave. and our expectations are shaped almost entirely by our experience of the surface world, the world of sunlight and warmth and air and the familiar creatures that share our environment. In that world, bodies tend to be symmetric and solid. They tend to be mobile and fast. They tend to be active and energetic. They tend to use visible light to navigate and communicate and find food. These are the norms of the surface world, and deep-sea creatures violate almost every one of them. But here is the crucial insight. These creatures are not strange relative to their environment. They are perfectly matched to it. Their transparency is not a flaw. It is a perfect solution to the problem of visibility in a dark environment. Their slowness is not a weakness. It is the optimal response to an environment where energy is scarce and must be conserved. Their enormous mouths and expandable stomachs are not grotesque excess. They are the mathematically correct solution to the problem of infrequent, unpredictable food availability. Their bioluminescent organs are not bizarre ornaments. They are a sophisticated, efficient communication and hunting system, perfectly calibrated to an environment of permanent darkness. What makes these creatures seem alien is not their relationship to their environment. Their relationship to their environment is as logical and harmonious as the relationship of a hummingbird to a flower. What makes them seem alien is their relationship to us, to our expectations, our assumptions, our deep intuition that the way life works in the world we inhabit is the default, the norm, the standard against which everything else should be measured. It is not. The surface world is one way of being alive. It is the way we are most familiar with because it is the way we are. But the deep ocean is another way of being alive, equally valid, equally sophisticated, equally the product of billions of years of evolution testing and refining and perfecting solutions to the specific challenges of a specific environment. The creatures of the deep are not failed versions of surface creatures. They are successful versions of themselves. And in understanding that, in truly grasping that the strangeness of the deep is not failure but adaptation, not error but precision, not alien but simply different, we begin to understand something profound about the nature of life itself. Life is not a specific set of features and behaviors and body plans. Life is a capacity to extract energy from an environment, to maintain internal order against the tendency toward disorder, to reproduce and vary and evolve, and to find in whatever environment exists the specific set of adaptations that turns that environment from a challenge into a home. The deep ocean has been doing this for hundreds of millions of years. Long before the first ray-finned fish evolved in the shallows, the deep ocean was populated by organisms adapted to its conditions. Long before the first land vertebrate pulled itself onto a beach, the deep ocean was running its quiet, slow, perfectly efficient economy of life. Long before the first human being looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond the stars, the creatures of the deep ocean were living, hunting, glowing, and evolving in perfect darkness, unobserved, uncatalogued, unknown, but undeniably, magnificently, persistently alive. We are only now, with the technology of deep-sea submersibles and remotely operated vehicles and high-definition underwater cameras and sonar systems of unprecedented resolution, beginning to understand what is actually down there. And what we are finding every time we look is more life, more diversity, more complexity, and more ingenuity than we had imagined. Every dive to a new location on the deep seafloor reveals species that science has never seen before. Every sample of deep-sea sediment contains microbial communities of extraordinary richness. Every new depth record reveals organisms surviving in conditions we had thought impossible for life. The deep ocean is not a dead zone. It is not the end of life. It is, in the truest and most literal sense, the largest living space on our planet, and it is full of life that has been living there, adapting and evolving, for timescales that make all of human history seem like a single heartbeat. It is a world that humbles us, challenges us, and ultimately invites us to think bigger, not just about what lies in the dark water below, but about what life is, what it requires, and how far it can reach in its endless, patient, magnificent search for a way to exist. In the second part of our journey, we will go deeper into the specific mechanisms of deep-sea adaptation, into the physics of pressure and cold, into the extraordinary biochemistry of creatures that live at the edge of what biology can sustain, into the ecology of the deep seafloor and the extraordinary communities that build up around vents and whale falls and other concentrated energy sources. We will explore how the deep ocean connects to the surface world through currents and migrations and the biological pump, and why the health of the deep ocean is inseparable from the health of the ocean as a whole. But for now, as we pause at this point in our descent, take a moment to consider what we have already seen. We have watched light fail and life respond. We have watched eyes grow enormous and then disappear entirely. We have watched metabolism slow and bodies lighten and hunting strategies transform from active pursuit to patient waiting. We have watched bioluminescence replace sunlight as the currency of visibility in the dark. We have watched the architecture of bodies change in response to the specific demands of pressure and cold and scarcity. And we have watched, at the very deepest points, life persist in conditions that our instincts tell us should be incompatible with any living thing. What the deep ocean shows us is not the limit of life. It is the range of life, the extraordinary, breathtaking, humbling range of forms and strategies and solutions that 4 billion years of evolution has produced on a single, water-covered planet in a quiet corner of an unremarkable galaxy. It shows us that the familiar is not the only. It shows us that the surface world is not the whole world. It shows us that in the darkest, coldest, most pressurized places on Earth, where no sunlight has ever reached and no human has ever been, life is there. Patient and efficient and perfectly adapted and entirely indifferent to our presence, because it has been getting along without us for hundreds of millions of years and will continue to do so long after we are gone. That is the deep ocean, and we have only just begun to explore it. We left our descent at a moment of profound realization, the understanding that the creatures of the deep ocean are not strange because they have failed to be something recognizable, but because they have succeeded so completely at being something else entirely. They are not approximations of surface life that went wrong somewhere along the way. They are finished, refined, elegant answers to a completely different set of questions. And now, in this second part of our journey, we are going to go further. We are going to push past the point where we stopped and look more carefully, more slowly, more deliberately, with the kind of patient attention that the deep ocean itself demands at the specific details of how life in the deep actually works. Not just the broad strokes of adaptation and evolution, but the specific, granular, molecular, and physiological and behavioral mechanisms that allow living things to exist in conditions that seem, by every surface world intuition, to be absolutely incompatible with life. Because the details matter. The details are where the real astonishment lives. Anyone can look at a photograph of an anglerfish or a gulper eel and feel a vague sense of wonder at its strangeness. But the true depth of the wonder that stays with you, that changes the way you think about biology and evolution and the nature of life, comes from understanding not just what these creatures look like, but how they work. How the proteins in a hadal snailfish's muscles remain functional under pressures that would denature the proteins of any surface creature. How the bioluminescent organs of a dragonfish produce light of such precise wavelength that it is invisible to most other deep-sea creatures, but perfectly visible to the dragonfish itself, giving it a private searchlight in the dark. How a sperm whale, a warm-blooded, air-breathing mammal that evolved on the surface of the ocean, has developed the physiological tools to descend 2 kilometers into the deep, hold its breath for 90 minutes, and return safely, one of the most remarkable feats of physiological adaptation in the entire animal kingdom. These details are what this second part of our journey is about, and they begin, as so many things in the deep ocean begin, with pressure. Pressure is the defining physical reality of the deep ocean. It shapes everything. It constrains everything. It is the single most pervasive and relentless environmental force acting on every organism below the surface, and its effects on biology are so fundamental that understanding them is essential to understanding anything else about how deep sea life works. Pressure in the ocean increases linearly with depth. For every 10 meters of depth, pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere, 1 standard unit of pressure, equivalent to the weight of the entire atmosphere above us pressing down on every square centimeter of surface area. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is 1 atmosphere. At 100 meters depth, it is 11 atmospheres, 10 from the water above plus 1 from the atmosphere. At 1,000 meters, it is 101 atmospheres. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, at nearly 11,000 meters, it is approximately 1,100 atmospheres, 1,100 times the pressure we experience at the surface. To put that in terms that connect to something in daily experience, 1,100 atmospheres is roughly equivalent to having 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of a single square meter of surface area. It is a pressure so extreme that it compresses seawater itself. The water at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is measurably denser than water at the surface, though water is considered nearly incompressible under most conditions. It is a pressure that would crush a styrofoam cup to the size of a thimble, collapse an unpressurized metal container like a crumpled piece of paper, and kill a human being so rapidly and completely that the process would be essentially instantaneous. And yet organisms live there, not despite this pressure, but in complete biological harmony with it. Because the key to surviving in high-pressure environments is not resisting the pressure, which is impossible for soft-bodied organisms, but matching it. The tissues of deep-sea organisms are largely incompressible in the same way that water is largely incompressible. A deep-sea fish is not being crushed at depth because its body contains no air-filled spaces that can be compressed. There are no lungs, no swim bladders, no gas-filled cavities. Every internal space is filled with fluid at the same pressure as the surrounding water. The organism is, in a sense, in pressure equilibrium with its environment. It is not a sealed container resisting external force, but an open system in balance with it. This is why the fish at the bottom of the Mariana Trench can swim and feed and behave normally under pressures that would be instantly lethal to us. The pressure is not acting on them in the way it would act on us, because our bodies contain air-filled spaces, our lungs, our sinuses, the spaces in our middle ears that would be catastrophically compressed by the weight of water above. An organism with no such air-filled spaces, with tissues matched in density to the surrounding water, experiences pressure not as a crushing force but simply as the ambient condition of its environment, no more crushing than the air pressure of the surface feels to us, which is to say, not crushing at all. But while the mechanical problem of pressure can be solved by matching tissue density to water density, the biochemical problem of pressure is far more complex and far more interesting. Pressure at depth does not just act on gas-filled spaces. At the molecular level, high pressure affects the folding and function of proteins, the molecular machines that perform essentially every biological function in every living cell. Proteins work by folding into specific three-dimensional shapes, and these shapes are maintained by weak molecular interactions, hydrogen bonds, van der Waals forces, hydrophobic interactions that are extremely sensitive to environmental conditions. Temperature changes these interactions, so does pressure. At high pressure, protein folding is disrupted. The specific three-dimensional shapes that proteins need to assume in order to function are destabilized. Enzymes, proteins that catalyze chemical reactions, lose their ability to bind their target molecules and accelerate their reactions. Structural proteins, proteins that give cells their shape and integrity, lose their rigidity. The entire biochemistry of a cell begins to fail, not because any single component has been broken, but because the physical conditions are no longer compatible with the delicate molecular geometries that make life's chemistry work. This is why the proteins of surface organisms fail at high pressure. And this is why deep-sea organisms have had to evolve proteins that are specifically engineered by millions of years of selection pressure to maintain their correct three-dimensional shapes under the pressures found at their particular depth. The proteins of a hadal snailfish are not the same as the proteins of a surface fish that have merely been compressed. They are different proteins with different amino acid sequences that have evolved to be stable and functional under conditions that would unfold and destroy the proteins of any surface creature. The study of these pressure-adapted proteins is one of the most active and fascinating areas of deep-sea biology, because the specific molecular modifications that make proteins pressure-stable reveal something profound about the relationship between physical environment and molecular evolution. One of the key adaptations, as mentioned in our first part, is the accumulation of trimethylamine oxide, TMAO, in the tissues of deep-sea fish. TMAO is a small organic molecule that acts as what biochemists call a piezolyte, a pressure-counteracting solute. Its presence in solution physically stabilizes the three-dimensional structure of proteins against the effects of pressure, essentially doing externally what pressure-stable amino acid sequences do internally, maintaining the correct geometry of the protein molecule. What is remarkable about TMAO is the precision with which its concentration tracks depth. Shallow water fish have relatively low concentrations of TMAO in their tissues. As you move to deeper water species, TMAO concentrations increase in direct proportion to the depth at which those species live. This is not a coincidence. It is a finely tuned biochemical response to a precisely quantifiable physical pressure. The concentration of TMAO required to counteract the destabilizing effect of pressure on proteins at a given depth is, within the range studied, essentially what is found in the tissues of fish living at that depth. Evolution has calibrated the biochemistry of deep-sea fish to match the physical demands of their environment with a precision that is almost engineering-like in its exactitude. But TMAO has a cost. At very high concentrations, TMAO itself begins to interfere with other biochemical processes. It interacts with other molecules in ways that can become problematic at concentrations above a certain threshold. Researchers have calculated that above approximately 8,500 meters, the concentration of TMAO required to counteract the destabilizing effect of pressure on proteins would be so high that it would become biochemically toxic in other respects, disrupting other molecular processes and ultimately preventing normal cellular function. This suggests that there is a natural depth limit for fish, a depth below which the biochemical tools available for pressure adaptation become inadequate, not because they stop working, but because using them in sufficient quantities would create other problems that are equally fatal. This theoretical limit matches remarkably well with the deepest verified depth records for fish. No fish has been reliably documented below approximately 8,400 meters. This is not, researchers believe, a coincidence or a sampling artifact. It appears to reflect a genuine biochemical ceiling, a depth at which the particular set of molecular tools that fish use for pressure adaptation reaches its functional limit. Below that depth, in the hadal trenches that extend to 11 kilometers, fish simply cannot exist. Other organisms, amphipods, polychaetes, holothurians, and microorganisms, can, because they either use different biochemical strategies for pressure adaptation, or, in the case of single-celled microorganisms, have cellular architectures that respond differently to pressure than the complex multicellular tissues of vertebrates. This kind of limit, a biological constraint imposed not by the physical impossibility of existence, but by the biochemical cost of the adaptations required for existence, is one of the deep ocean's most important and instructive features. It demonstrates that adaptation has limits. Evolution is extraordinarily creative, but it works with what is available. The molecular machinery of life has finite flexibility, and there are environmental conditions extreme enough that even the full creative power of hundreds of millions of years of evolution cannot produce an organism capable of thriving there. The hadal zone is close to that limit for complex multicellular life. That any multicellular organism exists there at all is itself remarkable. That the limit appears to be biochemical rather than physical reveals something important about where the real constraints on life lie. Let us turn now from the physics and biochemistry of pressure to something equally fundamental, the question of temperature and cold. The deep ocean is cold, profoundly, uniformly, consistently cold. With the exception of the areas immediately around hydrothermal vents, those extraordinary geological features we touched on in our first part, the deep ocean temperature varies only slightly from its mean of approximately 2 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees above freezing. Throughout most of the deep ocean, throughout the bathypelagic and abyssal and hadal zones, the temperature is approximately 2 degrees Celsius and has been for millions of years. For warm-blooded animals, this temperature is challenging but manageable. We know this because sperm whales and other deep-diving marine mammals regularly descend into waters of this temperature without apparent ill effect, largely because they maintain their body temperature through their own metabolic heat generation and through insulating layers of blubber. But for cold-blooded animals, fish, invertebrates, and the vast majority of deep-sea organisms, cold creates a biochemical challenge analogous to the biochemical challenge of pressure. The enzymes and proteins that drive metabolism, muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and every other biological process work best at specific temperatures. Too cold, and these molecular machines slow down, losing their flexibility and reactivity. Chemical reactions that proceed readily at surface temperatures may become vanishingly slow at 2 degrees Celsius. Deep-sea organisms have solved this problem through the same fundamental strategy used for pressure adaptation, evolving proteins with different amino acid sequences that maintain their function at low temperatures. Cold-adapted enzymes, technically called psychrophilic enzymes, have evolved to be flexible and reactive at low temperatures that would render the equivalent enzymes in surface organisms effectively non-functional. This flexibility comes from structural modifications that reduce the rigidity of the enzyme molecule, more glycine residues and fewer proline residues in their amino acid chains, reduced numbers of disulfide bonds, differences in the composition of their hydrophobic cores, all of which make the protein more supple and adaptable at low temperatures. But cold-adapted proteins come with their own trade-off. The same flexibility that makes them function well at low temperatures tends to make them less stable at higher temperatures. Bring a deep-sea enzyme to surface temperature, and it often unfolds and loses function, the opposite of what happens when a surface enzyme is subjected to deep-sea cold. This thermal lability of cold-adapted proteins is not a design flaw. It is a necessary consequence of the molecular architecture required for cold function. And it has an important implication. Deep-sea organisms are exquisitely adapted to the specific temperature of their environment and are genuinely unable to function at significantly different temperatures. The cold of the deep ocean is not just a challenge they have overcome. It has become the specific condition under which their biology operates optimally. This creates a degree of sensitivity to temperature change that has become a significant concern as ocean temperatures rise due to climate change. The deep ocean has historically been one of the most thermally stable environments on Earth, its temperature changing on geological time scales of thousands of years, giving evolutionary processes ample time to adjust. The rate at which the deep ocean is now warming is, by geological standards, extraordinarily rapid. Whether evolutionary processes can keep pace with this change, and what happens to the finely calibrated biochemistry of deep-sea organisms if their thermal environment shifts faster than their proteins can evolve, is one of the most pressing questions in deep-sea biology today. Now we must explore one of the aspects of deep-sea life that most profoundly challenges our surface world intuitions, the question of time. Not time in the sense of evolution and geological change, though that is relevant, but time in the sense of biological time, the pace at which individual organisms live their lives, grow, reproduce, and die. Because in the deep ocean, time moves differently, not metaphorically, but biologically. The metabolic clocks of deep-sea organisms tick at a fraction of the rate of their surface equivalents, and the consequences for how long these creatures live, how quickly they grow, and how slowly they reproduce are extraordinary. At the surface, the fast pace of life, driven by abundant food, warm temperatures, and intense competition, selects for rapid growth, early reproduction, and generally shorter lives. Surface fish in productive, competitive environments often grow quickly, reach sexual maturity in a year or two, reproduce prolifically, and live for only a few years before being eaten or dying of other causes. The ecological logic is clear. In an environment where resources are abundant and predation is intense, getting big, reproducing early, and producing many offspring maximizes the probability of leaving genes in the next generation. The deep ocean inverts almost every element of this logic. Food is scarce, so rapid growth is impossible even if the energy budget would otherwise support it. Cold temperatures slow metabolism and all metabolic processes, including growth. The low intensity of predation, not because predators are absent, but because the low density of prey means encounter rates between any individual organism and its predators are low, reduces the premium on growing quickly to escape predation. And the low overall pace of life means that individual organisms have time, biological time, developmental time, to grow slowly but eventually to large sizes, and to live for extraordinarily long periods. The lifespans recorded for deep-sea organisms are, by surface standards, almost unbelievable. The orange roughy, a deep-sea fish found at depths of several hundred to over 1,000 meters, can live for more than 150 years. This is not an outlier. It is consistent with the biology of a slow metabolizing, cold water fish in a low food availability environment. Deep-sea rockfish have been aged at over 200 years. Deep-sea clams living at hydrothermal vents and cold seeps have been estimated at several hundred years old. The ocean quahog, a clam found in cold, deep Atlantic waters, has been documented at over 500 years of age. One individual, nicknamed Ming by the researchers who aged it, was determined to be 507 years old when it was collected, making it the oldest recorded animal with a verified age in scientific history. 507 years old, a single clam, born decades before any European ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Living through centuries of human history, wars, revolutions, the rise and fall of empires, the development of technology from the printing press to the space shuttle, entirely unaware of any of it, in the cold, dark water, filtering food particles from the sea and growing its shell 1 micron at a time, year by year, century by century. This extraordinary longevity has implications that go beyond mere curiosity. Long-lived species tend to be highly vulnerable to overexploitation because their life histories, long juvenile periods before sexual maturity, low reproductive rates, slow population growth mean that populations cannot recover quickly from large reductions in numbers. An orange roughy that takes 20 to 30 years to reach sexual maturity and produces a small number of offspring each year cannot recover from heavy fishing pressure in the way that a fast-growing, rapidly reproducing surface fish can. The populations of long-lived deep-sea fish that were targeted by commercial fisheries in the 20th century, before their life history characteristics were fully understood, were in some cases reduced to fractions of their original abundance and have failed to recover decades later. This is the biological cost of slow time. Long life and slow metabolism and delayed reproduction are perfectly adapted to an environment of stable, low-intensity food availability. They are catastrophically maladapted to the sudden, intense disturbance of industrial-scale harvesting. The deep ocean's organisms have not had to evolve resilience to the kind of rapid, large-scale population reduction that human activity can impose because nothing in their evolutionary history has prepared them for it. They are slow and patient and long-lived, and in the world they evolved in, those qualities are strengths. In a world shaped by human economic activity, they become devastating vulnerabilities. Let us now explore something that connects the deep ocean to the surface world in a way that most people never think about: the remarkable phenomenon of vertical migration, one of the largest daily animal movements on Earth. Every day as the sun rises above the surface of the ocean, billions of organisms perform a migration that is invisible to almost everyone but is happening continuously, right now, in every ocean on the planet. They descend. They move downward, away from the surface and into the deeper, darker water below, retreating from the light and the predators that use it. And every night as the sun sets and darkness falls over the surface, they ascend, rising through the water column to spend the night feeding at the surface before the dawn sends them back down. This daily vertical migration, the vertical migration, to use the technical term, is performed by an astonishing diversity of organisms. Copepods, the tiny crustaceans that are among the most abundant animals in the ocean, migrate vertically by hundreds of meters each day. Euphausiids, krill, do the same. Many species of myctophid fish, the lanternfishes that are among the most abundant vertebrates in the ocean, make daily vertical migrations of several hundred meters. Squid, shrimp, jellyfish, and dozens of other groups participate in this enormous daily movement. In total, the biomass of organisms performing vertical migration every day is so vast that it constitutes one of the most significant biological processes on Earth, a daily pulse of life moving up and down through the water column, connecting the surface and the deep in ways that shape the chemistry and ecology of the entire ocean. Why do they do it? The logic is elegant. During the day, the surface waters are bright and warm and rich with food, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and the biological production of the sunlit zone. But during the day, the surface is also dangerous. Visual predators, fish, seabirds, marine mammals, hunt by sight in the surface waters, and the clarity and brightness of the surface ocean makes visual predation extremely effective during daylight hours. An organism that is nutritionally dependent on surface production but physically vulnerable to surface predation faces a dilemma: how to access the food while minimizing exposure to the predators. The vertical migration is the solution. Spend the dangerous daylight hours in the dim, cold, food-poor water of the mesopelagic zone, where visual predators are less effective and where the cold slows your own metabolism, reducing your caloric needs. Then, under the cover of darkness, ascend to the surface to feed in safety, or at least in relative safety, since the absence of light reduces but does not eliminate predation risk. Descend again before dawn, repeat every day for an entire lifetime. This strategy represents an extraordinary energetic trade-off. The migration itself costs energy. Swimming hundreds of meters up and then hundreds of meters back down every day requires a significant caloric expenditure. But the caloric gain from feeding at the productive surface and the reduction in predation mortality that comes from avoiding daylight exposure more than compensate for the cost of the migration. The math works out in favor of migration, which is why this strategy has evolved independently in so many different groups of organisms across essentially every ocean on Earth. But the vertical migration does something else, something that the organisms performing it have no awareness of, but that shapes the chemistry of the entire ocean. It pumps carbon from the surface to the deep. During the night, migrating organisms feed at the surface, consuming organic carbon produced by phytoplankton. They then descend with that carbon in their bodies. At depth, they respire, excrete, and produce fecal material, all of which releases carbon into the deep water, far below the surface where it was originally fixed. When the organisms die, their carbon-rich bodies sink further. The net effect is a transport of carbon from surface to deep that is substantial. Some estimates suggest that vertical migration may contribute as much to the biological carbon pump as the passive sinking of marine snow. It is not just a behavioral adaptation for individual survival. It is a planetary-scale biogeochemical process of enormous importance. The relationship between the deep ocean and the surface world is not limited to vertical migration. It is built into the very circulation of the ocean itself, a global system of currents so vast and so slow that a single parcel of water may take 1,000 years to complete a circuit of the ocean's depths. This system, the thermohaline circulation or the global ocean conveyor belt, connects every ocean basin on Earth through a continuous, slow movement driven by differences in the temperature and salinity of seawater. Cold, salty water is denser than warm, fresh water. In the polar regions, particularly in the North Atlantic and around Antarctica, surface water is cooled by the cold polar atmosphere and gains salt as sea ice forms, removing fresh water and leaving the remaining water more concentrated. This cold, dense water sinks, flowing down through the water column and spreading along the seafloor into the deep ocean basins of the world. It flows south from the North Atlantic, around Antarctica, and northward into the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where it gradually warms and rises back to the surface over centuries and millennia before flowing as a surface current back toward the poles to complete the circuit. This circulation does something extraordinary for the deep ocean. It continuously supplies it with oxygen. The water that sinks in the polar regions carries with it the oxygen that it absorbed at the surface, oxygen produced by phytoplankton and absorbed from the atmosphere. This oxygen-rich water flows through the deep ocean, maintaining the oxygen concentrations that deep-sea organisms need to breathe. Without the thermohaline circulation, the oxygen in the deep ocean would gradually be consumed by the respiration of deep-sea organisms and the decomposition of organic material, and the deep ocean would become anoxic, lacking in oxygen, which would fundamentally change the nature of life there. The thermohaline circulation also transports nutrients. The deep water carries dissolved nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, silica, that have accumulated from the decomposition of organic material sinking from above. When this deep water eventually upwells back to the surface, it carries these nutrients with it, fertilizing the surface ocean and driving some of the most productive fisheries on Earth. The great upwelling zones along the western coasts of continents in the Pacific and Atlantic, where winds drive surface water offshore and cold, deep, nutrient-rich water rises to replace it, are driven ultimately by the same thermohaline circulation that keeps the deep ocean oxygenated. The deep ocean and the surface ocean are not separate systems. They are different parts of a single, connected global circulation that links them in a continuous exchange of water, heat, nutrients, oxygen, and carbon. The connections between the surface and the deep become dramatically visible in the phenomenon of whale falls, one of the most remarkable ecological events in the ocean, and one that illustrates with extraordinary clarity how the deep ocean exploits every available source of energy with a completeness and efficiency that has no surface equivalent. When a whale dies in the open ocean, its body, which may weigh tens of thousands of kilograms, begins a journey to the seafloor. The descent of a whale carcass through the water column is not a simple sinking. It is a complex ecological event that begins almost immediately after death and continues for potentially decades on the seafloor. As the whale descends, it is attacked by opportunistic scavengers, large sharks, hagfish, and other mobile predators drawn to the chemical plume of dissolving organic material that the carcass releases as it sinks. By the time it reaches the seafloor, the carcass may already be partially consumed. But what remains, even a partially consumed whale carcass, represents an enormous concentrated package of organic energy, the equivalent of hundreds of years of normal marine snow input to a small area of seafloor. The succession of communities that colonizes a whale fall has been studied in detail at natural and experimentally placed carcasses, and what researchers have found is nothing less than a complete ecological succession. a sequence of distinct communities, each exploiting a different aspect of the carcass resource, each giving way to the next as the nature of the available resource changes over time. The first community to arrive, the mobile scavenger stage, consists of large, mobile organisms attracted by the chemical signals of fresh organic material. Sleeper sharks, hagfish, ratfish, and large invertebrates that consume the soft tissue of the carcass, stripping it to bone within months to a few years, depending on the size of the whale. As the soft tissue disappears, a second community establishes itself, the enrichment opportunist stage, characterized by dense mats of opportunistic bacteria and the invertebrates that feed on them, colonizing the bone and the surrounding sediment that has been enriched by organic material from the carcass. Polychaete worms, crustaceans, and mollusks colonize in high densities, exploiting the localized concentration of food in an environment where food is normally extraordinarily sparse. But the most remarkable stage of whale fall succession is the third, the sulfophilic stage. As bacteria decompose the lipid-rich bone of the whale, they produce hydrogen sulfide, the same compound that fuels the chemosynthetic communities of hydrothermal vents. This hydrogen sulfide supports a community of chemosynthetic bacteria and the organisms that feed on them, functionally analogous to the vent communities we discussed in Part 1, but powered not by the heat of the Earth's interior, but by the chemical energy locked in the lipid-rich bones of the whale. Vestimentiferan tube worms, the same family that dominates hydrothermal vent communities, have been found colonizing whale falls. Specialized mussels, clams, and other bivalves that host chemosynthetic bacteria in their tissues establish themselves around the sulfide-producing bones. A complete vent-like community builds up on what is now essentially a bare whale skeleton on the seafloor. This whale fall community may persist for decades, slowly consuming the energy stored in the whale's bones until the last of the sulfide-producing lipids are exhausted and the community gradually transitions to the surrounding abyssal community. During this time, a single whale carcass may support more species than exist in any comparable area of the surrounding abyssal plain, serving as an island of biodiversity in the deep-sea desert. Scientists studying the genetics of whale fall communities have made a discovery that deepens the significance of these oases in a remarkable way. Some of the species found at whale falls are also found at hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, other chemosynthetic environments scattered across the deep seafloor. This raises a profound question about how organisms specialized for chemosynthetic environments, which are patchy, geologically temporary features of the seafloor, manage to disperse between them across vast distances of inhospitable abyssal plain. The answer, researchers now believe, may be whale falls. The whale falls distributed across the ocean floor may serve as stepping stones between vent and seep habitats, temporary, intermediate habitats that allow specialized organisms to survive the journey between more permanent chemosynthetic environments. Whales, in death, may be providing the ecological infrastructure that allows vent and seep communities to persist and diversify across the global ocean. It is one of the most elegant examples of ecological connectivity in the natural world. The ecology of the deep seafloor is not limited to the communities that build up around concentrated energy sources like whale falls and vents. The vast majority of the abyssal plain, by area, far more than the vent and seep communities, supports a community of organisms living on the background input of marine snow, and this community, though far less dramatic than the vent communities, is in many ways more important for understanding the deep ocean as a whole. The soft sediments of the abyssal plain are teeming with microbial life. A single milliliter of deep-sea sediment may contain tens of millions of bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms representing an astonishing diversity of metabolic strategies and genetic lineages. These microorganisms are the decomposers of the deep ocean, the organisms responsible for breaking down the organic material that sinks to the seafloor and recycling its component molecules back into the water column. They are responsible for much of the chemical processing that makes the deep sediment such a chemically active environment, despite its apparent stillness and homogeneity. Among the most remarkable discoveries in deep-sea microbiology in recent decades is the existence of a deep microbial biosphere, a community of microorganisms living not just on the surface of the sediment but deep within it, buried under meters and tens of meters of sediment, living on organic material that has been buried for thousands or millions of years. These buried microorganisms are not dead. They are alive, but they are alive at a pace of biological activity so slow that it approaches the boundary of what we consider life. Some estimates suggest that the cells of the deep subsurface biosphere divide only once every few thousand years, metabolizing so slowly, extracting so little energy from the ancient organic material around them that their individual lives span geological time scales. The deep subsurface biosphere may contain a significant fraction of all the microbial cells on Earth. Estimates vary widely, but some calculations suggest that the total mass of microbial carbon in deep subsurface sediments may be comparable to the total mass of microbial carbon in the surface ocean. If this is even approximately correct, it means that a substantial portion of all the living organisms on Earth, by number of cells and perhaps by total mass, lives buried in deep-sea sediment, completely hidden from view, living at rates of metabolic activity so low that they push the definition of what we mean by life. These deep subsurface microorganisms represent an entirely novel mode of life, one that has been essentially unknown to science until very recently, one that operates on timescales and at energy levels that have no equivalent in the surface world. They are, in a very real sense, the most patient organisms on Earth. They are life stripped to its absolute minimum, the barest, most economical possible expression of the capacity to persist, to extract energy from a vanishingly impoverished environment, to maintain the minimal functions required to remain alive. They do not grow appreciably. They do not reproduce at any rate that is biologically meaningful on human timescales. They simply persist, molecule by molecule, using the meager chemical energy available to them to maintain the chemical gradient between inside and outside that is the most fundamental definition of a living cell. What keeps them alive? The same organic material that sank from the surface millions of years ago and was buried in the sediment, material that is, by the standards of the surface world, nearly completely depleted of nutritional value. But these organisms are so efficient, so economical in their use of energy, that they can extract a biological existence from resources that would be meaningless to a surface organism. They represent the absolute lower limit of what life requires, the proof that life's demands, while not infinitely flexible, are far more minimal than we had ever imagined. The physical and chemical and biological details we have been exploring, the pressure adaptations, the temperature adaptations, the extraordinary lifespans, the patient metabolisms, the whale fall communities, the deep subsurface biosphere, all of these converge on a single central question that the deep ocean poses to anyone who takes it seriously. What does the deep ocean tell us about the nature of life, and what does it tell us about ourselves and our place in the living world? The first answer, and perhaps the most obvious, is that it tells us that life is far more flexible and far more resilient than we tend to assume. We are accustomed to thinking of life as a fragile thing, something that exists only within narrow bands of temperature and chemistry and light, something easily disrupted by environmental change, something requiring careful stewardship and protection. And in many surface ecosystems, this is true. Coral reefs, tropical rainforests, freshwater systems, these are indeed fragile, easily disrupted by change, slow to recover from disturbance. But the deep ocean is not fragile in this sense. It is, in many respects, the most resilient ecosystem on Earth. It has persisted through every mass extinction in the geological record, through the Great Dying at the end of the Permian, through the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous, through every climate shift and ocean chemistry change that has occurred in the last 500 million years. Its organisms have adapted, suffered losses, and recovered again and again through conditions that wiped out the majority of surface life. This resilience comes not from resistance to change. Deep-sea organisms are not invulnerable, but from the extreme conservatism of the deep ocean environment itself. The conditions of the deep ocean, the cold, the dark, the pressure, the low food availability, have been remarkably stable over geological time. The surface world has been the theater of dramatic environmental change: ice ages, greenhouse intervals, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, continental collisions, sea level changes. These events have repeatedly disrupted surface ecosystems, driving mass extinctions and forcing rapid evolutionary change. The deep ocean, insulated by its enormous volume and thermal mass from the rapid changes happening at the surface, has been a haven of relative stability, a place where evolution could proceed at its natural slow pace, where organisms could invest in the kind of slow, careful, long-term strategies that work in a stable environment but fail in a variable one. But this stability also creates vulnerabilities when change does occur in the deep. The slow metabolism and long lifespans of deep-sea organisms, the patient strategies shaped by millions of years of stability, are precisely the features that make them vulnerable to rapid change. A surface species with a one-year life cycle can evolve genetically in response to changing conditions in decades or centuries. A deep-sea species with a 100-year life cycle needs thousands of years for the same degree of evolutionary response. The resilience of the deep ocean is real, but it is resilience to the kind of change that operates on geological timescales. It is not resilience to the kind of rapid, large-scale disruption that human activity is now capable of imposing. The physical disturbance of the deep seafloor by bottom trawling, deep sea mining, and other human activities is perhaps the most direct form of impact on the deep ocean. Bottom trawling, in which large, heavily weighted nets are dragged across the seafloor to catch commercially valuable fish and invertebrates, is one of the most destructive fishing methods in existence. When a bottom trawl passes over an area of deep seafloor, it does not simply remove the target species. It physically disrupts the sediment structure, destroys the three-dimensional habitats created by corals and sponges and other structural organisms, and kills or damages the entire benthic community in its path. Deep-sea coral reefs, which are not photosynthetic reefs like surface coral reefs, and which grow in cold, dark, deep water, are particularly vulnerable. Deep-sea corals grow extraordinarily slowly, some species adding only 1 millimeter or less to their height each year. A coral colony that is 1 meter tall may be 1,000 years old. A reef built by centuries of slow coral growth can be destroyed by a single pass of a bottom trawl in minutes, and the damage is essentially irreversible on any human timescale. The communities that depend on the three-dimensional structure of the reef, the fish that shelter among its branches, the invertebrates that feed in its current-catching topography, are lost with it, and the space they occupied is replaced by bare, disturbed sediment that may take centuries or millennia to recover, if it ever does. Deep-sea mining presents a different but equally significant set of concerns. The deep seafloor, particularly the abyssal plains, is covered in polymetallic nodules, potato-sized concretions of manganese, iron, nickel, copper, cobalt, and other metals that form over millions of years by the slow precipitation of dissolved metals from seawater. These nodules represent enormous concentrations of commercially valuable minerals, and as the demand for these metals has grown with the expansion of battery technology and renewable energy infrastructure, the economic pressure to mine the deep seafloor has increased dramatically. The ecological concern about deep-sea mining centers on both the direct destruction of seafloor habitat and the indirect effects of the sediment plumes that mining operations produce. Mining machines operating on the abyssal plain would disturb the sediment, releasing fine particles into the water column in plumes that could drift for hundreds of kilometers, potentially smothering filter-feeding organisms and disrupting the visual environment of bioluminescence-dependent organisms across vast areas. The organisms living in the nodule fields are diverse and poorly known. Because the nodule fields are among the least studied environments in the deep ocean, we do not have a complete picture of what lives there or how it functions ecologically. Mining areas that have been studied experimentally are still showing significantly different community composition decades after the initial disturbance, suggesting that recovery from deep-sea mining disturbance is extremely slow. These are serious concerns. But they exist in tension with other serious concerns: the demand for metals required for the batteries and electronics of renewable energy and electric vehicles, the potential for deep-sea mining to reduce the environmental impact of land-based mining in sensitive terrestrial habitats. The deep ocean does not exist in isolation from these questions. It is increasingly embedded in them, increasingly a part of the human economic and environmental calculus in ways that it was not even a few decades ago. How we navigate these tensions, how we weigh the economic value of deep-sea resources against the ecological value of the deep-sea environment, will determine what the deep ocean looks like for the organisms that have lived there for hundreds of millions of years. There is another dimension of the deep ocean's biology that we have not yet fully explored, and it is perhaps the most conceptually challenging of all: the question of intelligence and behavior in the deep. We tend to associate intelligence, complex problem-solving, learning, flexible behavior with the energetically costly neural hardware of large-brained surface animals. Mammals particularly have evolved extraordinarily large and complex brains as a result of the competitive, variable, socially complex environments of the surface world. The deep ocean, with its low energy availability and relatively simple, stable environment, might seem like a place where intelligence would be at a premium, where the cost of maintaining large, complex nervous systems would be prohibitive, and the selective benefits of complex cognition would be minimal. And indeed, most deep-sea organisms do not show the kind of behavioral flexibility we associate with intelligence. A deep-sea cucumber ingesting sediment or a deep-sea brittle star extending its arms into the current is not engaging in complex problem-solving. It is executing a behavioral program shaped by evolution to exploit a specific, predictable resource in a specific, predictable way. The environment's stability and predictability reduce the premium on flexible, intelligent behavior in the same way that a factory production line reduces the premium on the creative thinking of its workers. When the tasks are repetitive and the environment is stable, standardized responses outperform creative ones, but there are exceptions. The octopuses of the deep ocean, relatives of the surface octopuses that are among the most cognitively capable invertebrates known, are one of the most fascinating cases. Surface octopuses are remarkable for their intelligence. They learn quickly, solve novel problems, use tools, play, and show individual personalities. Their deep-sea relatives face a different cognitive environment, but some show comparable behavioral flexibility. The Dumbo octopus, named for the large ear-like fins it uses to maneuver, has been observed performing complex, apparently exploratory behaviors when encountered by deep-sea vehicles. Deep-sea octopuses have been seen tending their eggs for extraordinary periods. One Grainlodone boreapacifica female was observed guarding a clutch of eggs for 4.5 years, the longest known egg-brooding period for any animal, surviving without eating for the entire duration, slowly metabolizing her own body reserves to remain alert and protective until her eggs hatched. 4.5 years without eating. Sitting in the cold, dark water, keeping her eggs aerated and free of debris, driving away any organism that approached too closely. This behavior is not simple. It requires sustained attention, threat assessment, and the suppression of feeding behavior for an almost incomprehensibly long period. It is the ultimate expression of the deep ocean's patient, long-term strategy carried into the realm of parental behavior. A mother investing everything she has in a single reproductive event, because in an environment where food is scarce and uncertain, putting all of her remaining biological resources into a single clutch of well-protected eggs is more likely to produce surviving offspring than distributing those resources across multiple clutches with less protection. When her eggs finally hatched, the female was observed to die shortly afterward. She had given everything, her energy, her time, her biological resources, to a single reproductive act, and when that act was complete, she had nothing left. In the deep ocean, this is not tragedy, it is optimization. The sperm whale occupies a unique position in any discussion of the deep ocean, because it is perhaps the most dramatic example of a surface organism that has evolved the capacity to access the deep ocean's resources. It is a warm-blooded, air-breathing mammal. Its ancestors were land-dwelling creatures that returned to the sea. Its lungs require air. Its blood requires oxygen. Its brain is the largest of any animal on Earth. And yet it can descend to depths of more than 2,000 meters. Some records suggest approaches to 3 kilometers, hold its breath for 90 minutes or more, navigate in complete darkness, locate and capture prey with echolocation, and return safely to the surface to breathe again. The sperm whale is physiologically one of the most extraordinary animals that has ever existed. How does it do this? The answer involves a cascade of physiological adaptations so comprehensive and so well integrated that they represent an entire redesign of the mammalian body plan for deep diving. The sperm whale's lungs are flexible and collapsible. As it descends and pressure increases, its lungs compress, absorbing the residual air and preventing the nitrogen in that air from dissolving into the blood at high partial pressures, which would cause decompression sickness upon ascent. The flexibility of the whale's ribcage allows this compression without structural damage. By the time a sperm whale reaches significant depth, its lungs have collapsed almost completely, but the whale continues to function because it is not relying on lung-stored oxygen at that point. The sperm whale stores oxygen in 2 places that are far more efficient than the lungs, the blood and the muscles. Its blood has an extraordinarily high concentration of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells, far higher than human blood. And its muscles have an extraordinarily high concentration of myoglobin, the oxygen-storing protein in muscle tissue, which gives deep-diving whale muscle its characteristic dark red or almost black color. The total oxygen storage capacity of a sperm whale's blood and muscle is sufficient to supply its brain and other critical organs throughout a deep dive lasting close to 2 hours. But even this is not the whole story. During a deep dive, the sperm whale's body enters a physiological state called diving bradycardia. Its heart rate slows dramatically, dropping from a normal resting rate of several tens of beats per minute to just a few beats per minute at depth. Simultaneously, blood is redirected away from the muscles and digestive organs, which can tolerate temporary oxygen deprivation, and concentrated in the brain and heart, which cannot. The peripheral circulation essentially shuts down, allowing the limited remaining oxygen supply to be rationed to the organs that most need it. The muscles, deprived of blood-delivered oxygen, switch to anaerobic metabolism, generating energy without oxygen, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. This lactic acid accumulates in the muscle tissue throughout the dive and is cleared when the whale returns to the surface and begins breathing again. All of this happens automatically, without conscious control, as the whale descends. The diving bradycardia is a reflex triggered by cold water contacting the face. The blood redistribution is governed by specialized pressure-sensing mechanisms in the blood vessels. The switch to anaerobic metabolism in the muscles is a cellular response to falling oxygen concentrations. The whale does not need to think about any of it. These physiological systems work together seamlessly, having been refined over tens of millions of years of evolution in whale ancestors that progressively invaded deeper and deeper water in pursuit of the squid and fish that represent the primary prey of the sperm whale. And what the sperm whale goes after at depth in the complete darkness with echolocation as its primary sense are the giant and colossal squid creatures that represent, in many ways, the apex of deep-sea invertebrate evolution. We have mentioned the giant squid's dinner plate eye already, but the giant squid as a whole is a creature of extraordinary biological sophistication. It is among the largest invertebrates on Earth, capable of reaching lengths of 13 meters, including its long tentacles. Its nervous system, while fundamentally different in architecture from vertebrate nervous systems, is of comparable complexity. The giant squid's brain is donut-shaped, with the esophagus running through the center, and its neurons conduct electrical signals at rates comparable to vertebrate neurons. Its arms and tentacles are covered with suckers lined with razor-sharp chitinous rings that can cut into the flesh of anything they grip. The relationship between the sperm whale and the giant squid is one of the most dramatic predator-prey relationships in the deep ocean. Sperm whales carry the scars of giant squid suckers on their skin, circular marks, sometimes centimeters in diameter, that attest to battles fought in complete darkness at depths of a kilometer or more. The stomach contents of sperm whales contain giant squid beaks, the only hard parts of the squid that resist digestion, in numbers that tell a story of lifetimes spent hunting these enormous creatures in the deep. And the giant squid, with its enormous eyes, evolved specifically to detect the bioluminescent flashes of approaching sperm whales, is doing everything it can to avoid being eaten, a dynamic of predation and counter-adaptation, played out in the dark, that has been shaping the evolution of both species for millions of years. In exploring the specifics of how deep-sea organisms work, the biochemistry of their proteins, the physiology of their metabolism, the mechanics of their reproduction and feeding and behavior, we have been building toward a conclusion that is both scientific and philosophical. It is the conclusion that the deep ocean represents, in the fullest and most literal sense, a different way of being alive. Not a lesser way, not a simpler way, not a way that is inferior to or less sophisticated than the way of being alive that we are familiar with at the surface. A different way, one that prioritizes different things, operates on different timescales, uses different tools, and arrives at different solutions to the fundamental challenges of existence. The surface world prioritizes speed and energy expenditure and short-term competitive success. The deep ocean prioritizes efficiency and patience and long-term persistence. The surface world is an ecosystem of extravagance, of fast growth and high reproduction and the constant burning of abundant solar energy. The deep ocean is an ecosystem of economy, of slow growth and infrequent reproduction, and the careful, complete extraction of every available calorie from a meager and unpredictable food supply. Neither is better, neither is more evolved. They are different answers to the question of how to exist in the specific physical and chemical conditions of a specific environment, and both answers work. Both produce diverse, complex, functioning ecosystems that have persisted through billions of years of Earth history. The creatures of the deep ocean are not alien, not really. When we call them alien, we are revealing something about ourselves, about the narrowness of our frame of reference, the specific conditions of our evolutionary history, the particular environment that shaped our intuitions about what life should look like. We evolved in the light. We navigated by sight. We lived in a world of temperature and color and movement calibrated to what sunlight provides. And so we look at a creature shaped by the dark and the cold and the pressure and the scarcity, and we call it strange. But the strangeness is ours, not theirs. They are perfectly at home. We are the ones who do not belong. This is, in the end, the deep ocean's most important lesson. It teaches us that belonging is contextual, that what looks like wrong is often simply different, that what appears to be a distortion is often a perfect fit. The gulper eel's enormous mouth is not a mistake. The barreleye fish's transparent head is not a malfunction. The hydrothermal vent tube worm's dependence on internal chemosynthetic bacteria is not a compromise. They are right. They are exactly right for where they are. There is a specific quality of darkness that exists in the deep ocean that deserves its own moment of attention before we conclude this journey, because it is not merely the absence of light in a physical sense. It is a condition that has shaped the inner lives, the experiential worlds, the subjective realities, to whatever extent those concepts apply to deep-sea organisms of creatures over hundreds of millions of years. The darkness of the deep ocean is so complete and has existed for so long that it has become, for the organisms that live there, not a deprivation but simply the condition of existence. They have not lost the light. They never had it to lose. This is a profound distinction. We, with our evolved dependence on visual information, experience darkness as an absence, something missing, something that reduces our ability to understand and navigate our environment. We instinctively associate deep darkness with confusion, disorientation, vulnerability, but the creatures of the deep ocean did not evolve with light and then lose it. Their evolutionary lineages descended into the dark gradually, over millions of years, shedding light-dependent adaptations step by step as they moved into deeper and darker waters. Each generation experienced a world slightly darker than the one before, and the selection pressures of each generation of environments shaped a body and nervous system slightly more optimized for that specific level of darkness. The creatures that exist today in total darkness are not impoverished by the absence of light. Their entire biology is built around its absence. They do not miss it because in the only meaningful biological sense, they have never known it. This raises a question that is perhaps more philosophical than biological, but is irresistible nonetheless. What is the experiential world of a deep-sea creature like? What does it feel like, if it feels like anything at all, to be a dragonfish in the midnight zone, floating in complete darkness, sensing the world through the pressure waves detected by the lateral line, through the chemical gradients detected by olfactory organs, through the bioluminescent signals detected by eyes tuned to a narrow range of wavelengths? What is the subjective reality, if any exists, of a sperm whale navigating the deep by sound, building a three-dimensional acoustic image of a world it has never seen? What does the universe look like to an organism for which the universe is entirely tactile, entirely chemical, entirely pressure and vibration and touch? We cannot answer these questions definitively. The inner lives of other organisms are, by their nature, inaccessible to us. But asking them is valuable because it forces us to confront the full range of ways that a nervous system can construct a model of the world from the sensory data available to it. Our visual world, the rich, colorful, spatially detailed world we navigate with our dominant sense of sight, is one model among many possible ones. It is a model built from the specific sensory tools that evolution provided to an organism living in a sunlit environment. A model built from pressure waves and chemical gradients and bioluminescent signals would be different from ours, not impoverished, just different. It would have its own spatial detail, its own richness of information, its own particular way of encoding the texture and structure of the world. The deep ocean is full of beings constructing such different models of the world, navigating their lives through sensory frameworks that have no surface equivalent. They are not confused. They are not lost. They know their world as intimately and as precisely as any surface organism knows its own, more so, perhaps, given the stability and predictability of an environment that has not changed significantly in millions of years. The midnight zone is dark to us, but it is not dark to the things that live there. It is simply where they live. As we ascend from the deep, as we retrace our path upward through the abyssal zone, through the midnight zone, through the twilight zone, and back toward the familiar light of the surface, we carry with us a fundamentally altered understanding of what this planet is and what lives on it. We began this journey at the surface, in the light and warmth of a world that felt familiar and comprehensible. We understood how it worked. We recognized the creatures in it. We could name the processes that drove it: photosynthesis, predation, competition, migration. We felt at home, and then we went down, and the familiar became unfamiliar. The light faded, the rules changed, the creatures changed, the bodies changed, the behaviors changed, the timescales changed. And by the time we reached the bottom, by the time we found ourselves looking at a pale snailfish drifting through the darkness of the Mariana Trench, at a colony of tube worms swaying in the current of a hydrothermal vent, at the barely metabolizing microbial cells buried in sediment that was deposited 1,000,000 years before the first human walked the earth, the world had become something else entirely. Not a worse world, not a lesser world, a different world. A world that reminded us, insistently and unmistakably, that our world is not the whole world. The deep ocean covers more than 60% of Earth's surface and occupies more than 90% of Earth's habitable volume. It is home to the vast majority of Earth's species, most of which have never been seen or described by science. It plays a critical role in regulating the planet's climate, cycling its carbon, oxygenating its deep waters, recycling its nutrients. It has been doing all of these things for hundreds of millions of years, before there were any lungs to breathe the oxygen produced by its surface waters, before there were any eyes to see the sunlight that drives its surface productivity, before there were any minds to wonder about what lay beneath its surface. And it will continue doing them. The deep ocean is not waiting for us to understand it. It is not asking for our recognition or our appreciation. It existed before us, and it will, in all likelihood, exist long after us. Its creatures are patient in a way that is beyond our comprehension, patient not just individually, in their slow metabolisms and their centuries-long lives, but collectively, in the deep geological patience of an ecosystem that has outlasted every mass extinction and every climate catastrophe that has ever struck this planet. They will still be here. Adapted, changed, perhaps significantly different in their specific forms from what they are today, but present, alive, functioning, running the quiet, vast, essential biology of the deep ocean, long after every human structure has crumbled to dust. This is not a melancholy thought, it is a liberating one. It is a reminder that life on this planet is not fragile, not precarious, not dependent on any single species or any single ecosystem or any single set of conditions. It is robust, it is flexible, it is creative in ways that consistently exceed our expectations. It is already here in places we have never looked, doing things we have not yet imagined, with tools we have not yet described, in an environment we have barely begun to explore. The deep ocean is the proof. Not proof that everything will be fine regardless of what we do. We are capable of doing damage that matters, and the creatures of the deep are not immune to it. But proof that life is more than we think it is, that it reaches further, persists longer, adapts more completely, and finds ways to exist in circumstances more extreme than anything we have ever experienced. That the surface world, with all its familiarity and all its beauty, is just one room in a house of extraordinary size and complexity. And that the other rooms, the ones we have not yet entered, the ones still dark and unexplored and full of living things we have never seen, are waiting. We just have to go deeper. The shapes of deep-sea organisms reflect something beyond simple adaptation to their environment. They reflect the aesthetic of a completely different evolutionary logic, a logic in which beauty, to whatever extent natural selection produces anything we can call by that name, looks completely different from the beauty of the surface world. The gossamer, ribbon-like oarfish that occasionally washes up on beaches and has historically given rise to sea serpent legends. The translucent, iridescent comb jellies that drift through the mesopelagic, beating their cilia and sending waves of rainbow-colored bioluminescence rippling along their sides. The elaborate, branching fans of deep-sea coral growing in perfect geometric complexity in the cold dark, their polyps extending tiny tentacles into the current like a frozen galaxy of tiny flowers. The lanternfish with their precise rows of photophores along their flanks, glowing in patterns as specific and diagnostic as fingerprints, different for every species, a universe of living light signals evolved in the dark. These are not ugly creatures. They are creatures that violate our aesthetic categories, which are built on the same surface world assumptions that shape all our other judgments about the deep. When we apply the aesthetic standards of the surface world to the creatures of the deep, We get confusion, discomfort, the instinct to call them monstrous. But when we genuinely try to see them on their own terms, as organisms perfectly fitted to the specific demands and conditions of their environment, something shifts. The anglerfish, seen not as a grotesque monster but as a supremely efficient, beautifully adapted predator, becomes genuinely beautiful in the way that any truly well-designed thing is beautiful, the way a mathematically elegant proof is beautiful, or the way a piece of engineering that does exactly what it needs to do with no excess and no deficiency is beautiful. It is the beauty of function, of solution, of problem and answer perfectly matched. This is the aesthetic of the deep ocean, not the lush, colorful, exuberant beauty of a coral reef, but the spare, precise, functional beauty of an ecosystem that has been refined by hundreds of millions of years of extreme selection pressure to the point where nothing is wasted and nothing is misplaced. Every feature serves a purpose. Every behavior is calibrated. Every metabolic process is optimized. It is not the beauty of abundance. It is the beauty of economy. And in its way, it is more impressive than the beauty of the surface, because it has been produced not by the generous hand of unlimited solar energy, but by the rigorous, demanding logic of absolute scarcity, where only the perfectly adapted survive. We are nearing the surface now. The light is returning, the pressure is easing, the temperature is rising. Ahead of us, the familiar world of the surface, the sunlit water, the colorful fish, the busy ecosystem of the sunlit zone is waiting. We are returning from a place that most human beings will never see, in a world that most human beings will never think about, carrying knowledge that changes everything about how we understand the planet we live on. The deep ocean has given us gifts that we are only beginning to appreciate. The organisms that live there have evolved biochemical and physiological solutions to extreme environmental challenges, pressure-stable proteins, cold-adapted enzymes, extraordinarily efficient oxygen storage systems, novel metabolic pathways that represent potential models for biotechnology and materials science of enormous practical value. The deep-sea biosphere represents a repository of genetic diversity and biochemical innovation of incalculable worth. The ecological processes of the deep ocean, the biological carbon pump, the thermohaline circulation, the nutrient cycling of the abyssal community are essential to the health of the entire planet. Understanding them is not an academic luxury. It is a practical necessity for anyone who wants to understand how this planet's chemistry and climate function and what we are doing when we alter them. But beyond the practical, there is something else that the deep ocean gives us: perspective. It gives us the perspective of deep time, the understanding that we inhabit a planet with a biological history so long and so rich that our entire tenure on it is a brief footnote. It gives us the perspective of extreme diversity, the understanding that life's solutions to the challenges of existence are not limited to the ones we are familiar with, but span a range of possibility that we have only begun to map. And it gives us the perspective of humility, the understanding that we do not own this planet, that we are not its primary occupants, that the living world is far larger and far older and far stranger than anything our evolved intuitions were prepared to encounter. The deep ocean has been there through everything, through the appearance of the first photosynthetic organisms that changed the planet's atmosphere, through the great oxidation event that killed most of the life then existing and created the conditions for everything that came after, through the Cambrian explosion of animal body plans, through every mass extinction and every recovery, through the entire history of vertebrate life, from the first jawless fish to the first land vertebrate to the first primate to the first human. The deep ocean was there before all of it, and it will be there after all of it, its organisms slowly evolving, its chemistry slowly cycling, its sediments slowly accumulating the record of everything that has ever lived in the waters above. That is who we have been visiting. That is the world we have been exploring. Not a dead zone, not a desert, not a place of absence or emptiness or despair. The largest, oldest, most persistent, most resilient, most biochemically diverse, most ecologically essential habitat on Earth. a world of extraordinary patience and extraordinary beauty and extraordinary life hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, waiting to be understood. We have only just begun. What does it mean to have gone on this journey? What do you carry with you now back to the surface and the light that you did not have before? The knowledge of what lives in the dark, yes. The understanding of how it lives there, yes. The appreciation of the specific adaptations and strategies that make the deep ocean work, yes. But more than these facts, more than these specific pieces of biological and physical knowledge, what the deep ocean offers is a shift in perspective that cannot easily be put into words but can perhaps be gestured toward. The shift is this: the deep ocean makes the familiar world seem larger. Not smaller, as you might expect from a place that dwarfs every human achievement and makes our species feel small. Larger. Because when you understand that the world you can see is only a fraction of the world that exists, when you understand that the life you know is only a fraction of the life that has evolved, when you understand that the conditions you find comfortable and familiar are only a narrow slice of the conditions under which life has found ways to thrive, the world gets bigger. Your sense of what is possible gets larger. Your appreciation for the creativity and flexibility of the living world grows to encompass not just the familiar but the unfamiliar, not just the seen but the unseen, not just the surface but the depth. The deep ocean is down there right now. As you watch this, as you breathe, as your heart beats, it is there. The anglerfish is hanging motionless in the midnight zone, its bioluminescent lure swaying slowly in the still water. The snailfish is drifting through the darkness of the Mariana Trench, its pressure-stabilized proteins functioning perfectly at pressures that would kill almost anything else on Earth. The hydrothermal vent is pouring superheated, mineral-rich water into the cold abyssal water, and the tube worms around it are waving in the plume, their internal bacteria converting hydrogen sulfide into the organic molecules that sustain the entire vent community. The sperm whale is descending through the mesopelagic zone, its heart slowing, its lungs collapsing, its echolocation clicks pinging into the dark ahead of it as it searches for the giant squid that is simultaneously searching for signs of the whale's approach with its dinner plate eyes. All of this is happening now. All of this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years, in the dark, unseen, unknown for almost all of human history. And all of it will continue happening in its slow, patient, perfectly adapted way, long after any individual human being reading these words has become a part of the biological cycle that the deep ocean will eventually incorporate, process, and recycle. The deep ocean is not a metaphor. It is not a symbol. It is not a cautionary tale or an inspiration story or a backdrop for human drama. It is a real place with real organisms, living real lives that are as valid and as complex and as worthy of attention and understanding as any life on the surface. It simply requires us to go deeper in our thinking, in our curiosity, in our willingness to extend our understanding beyond the familiar and into the dark to find it. And when we do find it, when we really, fully, deeply find it, we find not strangeness but kinship. We find not alien life, but another expression of the same fundamental impulse that drives every living thing on this planet. The impulse to persist, to adapt, to find a way, in whatever environment exists, to be alive. That impulse is not ours alone. It belongs to the barreleye fish and the vampire squid and the hadal amphipod and the ancient clam and the barely metabolizing microbe buried in million-year-old sediment. It belongs to everything that has ever found a way to extract energy from the environment and use it to remain organized, to remain functional, to remain, however briefly, however slow, however patiently, however deep, alive. That is what the deep ocean is. That is what it shows us. That is what it has been showing the universe in its quiet and patient and completely indifferent way for longer than our species has existed to notice. We are fortunate to live in a time when we can finally, just barely, begin to see.